first person to walk in that morning froze in the doorway. The office didn't look like an office anymore. The lights didn't turn on. The cameras that usually stood like soldiers in the corner are gone. Even the cables that snaked across the floor had vanished. Once a busy studio now looked hollow and lifeless, like someone had sucked the soul out of it overnight. Then the boss stormed in. His footsteps were heavy, his face flushed, and when he saw the empty stands and dangling wires, he lost it. "Who did this? Who stripped my studio?" he shouted, his voice bouncing off the bare walls. The staff just looked at each other, confused, whispering in low tones. Some thought maybe thieves had broken in. Others guessed a rival company wanted to sabotage them. But the doors hadn't been forced. The locks were untouched. Whoever did this had walked in smoothly, like they belonged there and knew exactly what to grab, where it was kept, and how to leave without a trace. The boss, red-faced and furious, barked accusations at his team, but no one could answer. The fear in the room wasn't just about the missing gear. It was about the fact that the enemy wasn't outside the building. The enemy had been working beside them the whole time. And that truth was about to hit harder than anyone expected. While the boss screamed and the staff whispered, one name never crossed anyone's lips: Sophia. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments, who do you think really emptied the studio, and why was Sophia the only name no one dared to say out loud? She wasn't the loud one in meetings. She wasn't the type to crack jokes by the coffee machine or charm clients with big words. Sophia was the designer who stayed late, hunched over her work, eyes fixed on the screen while the office emptied. She was quiet, polite, almost invisible, the kind of person you forget to invite to drinks after work, but who always seemed to deliver when deadlines hit. And maybe that's why no one suspected her, because in their eyes, she wasn't capable of anything. She was just the designer, a background character in their story. But here's what no one realized. While they overlooked her, Sophia was taking notes. She knew every corner of that studio, every piece of equipment, every cable shoved into storage. She had labeled them, maintained them, carried them on her shoulders, when no one else bothered. So when the studio went dark that morning, it wasn't burglars. It wasn't sabotage from a rival. It was Sophia, the same woman they barely noticed, had been the one to strip the place bare. Her plan wasn't loud or reckless. She didn't just walk out with her things. She left behind a silence so sharp it cut through every voice in that office. And here's the part. No one in that room knew yet. Sophia wasn't finished. This was only her opening move. The woman they ignored was about to become unforgettable. A few weeks before the chaos, the office felt alive. The company had just signed a big client, and Richard, the boss, was on his usual victory lap. He walked around the studio, chest puffed out, patting the equipment like it was a prize he had personally won. "State-of-the-art setup," he boasted, his voice carrying across the room. "This is why clients trust us. I don't settle for cheap shortcuts." The team clapped. A few laughed politely. No one dared question him. Richard loved being the man of the hour, the genius who invested in everything. And why wouldn't they believe him? The cameras gleamed under the studio lights. The monitors flickered with crisp images. The cables looked perfectly in place. It all looked expensive, impressive and untouchable. But Sophia, standing off to the side, knew something no one else did. Those cameras, hers. The lighting rigs, hers. The cables, the stands, the backup gear stuffed in the closets. Every single piece had been bought with her own money, and just in case anyone ever forgot, she had marked them carefully. Tiny labels with her name, taped in places no one bothered to look. She had brought them in quietly, months earlier, when deadlines piled up and the company equipment kept breaking down. She hated sloppy work, hated the thought of sending out projects that looked cheap. So she stepped in, not for glory, not for praise, but because she believed in doing the job right. Richard knew. HR knew. Everyone knew, but no one ever mentioned it. Instead, they let Richard brag. They let him play the part of the generous boss, the man who gave his team the best tools. Clients showered him with compliments. The staff admired him. He was building his reputation on a lie, and the lie worked. Sophia never called him out. She didn't argue, didn't try to correct the narrative. She simply watched. Because some lies collapse better when you let them grow. But Richard grew too comfortable. He strutted around as if the gear was an extension of himself. The cameras weren't just cameras anymore. They were proof of his power. And the more he claimed them, the more invisible Sophia became. Then came the day she was called into HR on a Thursday afternoon. Sophia was in the middle of editing a client project when her inbox pinged. HR would like to meet with you at 3 p.m. Her stomach sank. She knew what it meant. Everyone did. Meetings like that weren't about promotions. They were about endings. At 3 o'clock sharp, she walked into the small, sterile HR office. A folder sat on the desk. Richard, her boss, was there too, leaning back in his chair like he had somewhere better to be. He didn't even look her in the eye. "Thanks for coming in, Sophia." The HR rep started, her voice clipped and professional. "We're restructuring. Unfortunately, today will be your last day." That was it. No speech about her years of work. No acknowledgement of the late nights, the deadlines she'd saved, the gear she'd carried in piece by piece to keep their projects alive. Richard picked up a pen, signed a form, and slid it across the desk, like he was handing her a receipt. "We appreciate your contributions," he mumbled, eyes fixed on the wall. Sophia sat perfectly still. No tears, no shaking. She just watched him. The same man who paraded her equipment in front of clients like it was his crown jewels couldn't even face her now. She signed the paper, stood up and left. The others in the office barely looked at her as she walked past. A few gave small, awkward smiles. Most kept their heads down. Richard didn't even notice she was gone. He was already laughing with someone in the hallway. Sophia stepped outside into the cool air, her hands shoved in her pockets. The world looked the same, but something inside her had shifted. For the first time in years, she felt strangely calm, because in that moment, she realized something Richard hadn't thought through. You don't discard someone who owns the very foundation of your kingdom. That night, Sophia went home, poured herself a glass of wine, and pulled out a notebook. She began writing a list of equipment. The cameras, 3 of them, the lighting rigs, the stands, the cables, even the small adapters she'd lent out and never gotten back. She remembered every piece because she'd bought every piece. Each one had her name on it, marked in places nobody else bothered to check. Page after page, the list grew. By the time she was done, it looked less like inventory and more like a map. A map of Richard's downfall. Sophia didn't rage or call HR to argue. She didn't storm back into the office demanding credit. None of that would work. Richard thrived on people's outbursts. He used them as proof they were unprofessional. No, this had to be different, quite strategic. If Richard wanted her gone, fine. She would vanish. But she wouldn't leave empty-handed. For years she had let him take credit for her tools, her effort, her brilliance. She had stayed quiet when he called the equipment his investment. She had let him wear her work like a badge of honor. That silence ended now. By the time she closed her notebook, the plan was clear. Richard thought she was finished, that he'd signed her away with the flick of a pen, that she'd disappear quietly, like so many before her. But Sophia wasn't gone. She was just getting started. Her plan wasn't rushed. It was precise. She had one night, the last night before her official exit, to do what no one in that building thought she'd dare. At midnight, the city outside was quiet, the streets nearly empty. Sophia parked her car just 2 blocks away, not close enough to raise suspicion, not far enough to waste time. She pulled up her hood, slid on a pair of gloves, and walked toward the glass doors of the office she'd given years of her life to. Her ID card still worked. No one had thought to disable it yet. That was their first mistake. The door clicked open, and Sophia stepped inside. The office felt different at night. Hollow. The hum of computers was gone, the chatter of phones replaced by silence. Only the faint buzz of the emergency lights lit the way. For the first time, she wasn't walking into her workplace. She was walking into a crime scene, one that hadn't happened yet, but was about to. She went straight to the studio. The cameras were first. 3 of them, expensive ones she'd saved months for, hauled in and guarded like treasure. Richard had bragged about them for months to clients. Tonight they went back to their rightful owner. She unplugged each one carefully, like pulling the heart out of a machine. One by one, she packed them into the hard cases she'd brought. Next, the lights. The heavy rigs that took 2 people to lift during shoots. Sophia managed them on her own, sweat breaking across her forehead as she lowered them, folded the stands, and rolled the cords neatly. She remembered the day Richard called them his investment. Now with her hands on the gear, the truth burned brighter than the lights ever had. But she didn't stop there. The storage closet, the place where forgotten equipment lived. Sophia opened it, and for a moment, the sight almost made her laugh. Her name, written in bold marker, was on everything. Cables, microphones, tripods shoved into corners. Even small adapters, the kind people thought were worthless, had her initials scratched into the metal. She filled bag after bag, until her arms ached. It wasn't just about taking back her property. It was about erasing Richard's lie piece by piece. Every box she carried out wasn't just equipment. It was proof. Proof that his empire was nothing but borrowed bricks. By 3 a.m. the studio looked wrong. Bare shelves, empty hooks, coiled wires hanging like veins cut from a body. Still, Sophia wasn't done. She walked over to Richard's office. She didn't need anything from there, but curiosity pulled her in. His desk was messy, papers scattered everywhere, but what caught her eye was a whiteboard covered in client schedules and notes. At the top, written in his bold handwriting, were the words, "My studio, my gear, my legacy." Sophia stared at it for a long moment. Then with the swipe of her hand, she erased it clean. By the time she carried the last case to her car, the sun was just beginning to hint at the horizon. Her back ached, her muscles burned, but she didn't care. She loaded the final piece into the trunk, closed it with a solid thud, and leaned against the car. She looked back at the office. Inside it was no longer a studio, no longer Richard's stage for lies. It was a shell. A hollow room waiting to expose the truth the second people walked in. Sophia smiled to herself, got into her car, and drove away. The city was waking up. Coffee shops opening, people rushing to buses. The world unaware of the silent heist that had just changed everything. The next morning started like any other. Employees filed in with half-empty coffee cups, yawning, scrolling through their phones. But the second they stepped into the studio, their faces froze. Something was wrong. The place looked like a crime scene. The cameras were gone. The lights were gone. Even the cables that once snaked across the floor had vanished. It wasn't just empty. It looked stripped. Like someone had peeled the skin off the studio and left only bones behind. At first people thought it was some kind of sick prank. Maybe IT moved stuff for maintenance? Someone whispered. Another laughed nervously. Burglars? Who'd even steal cables? But the laughter didn't last. The longer they stared, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Then Richard walked in. The moment his eyes landed on the hollow room, his face turned blood red. He slammed his briefcase down so hard it echoed across the silence. "Who did this?" he roared. "Who stripped my studio?" The word "my" clanged against the walls like a hammer. Staff exchanged nervous glances, none of them daring to speak. But the fear was contagious. Whispers started. Was it sabotage? Did a competitor get in? What if someone inside did it? Richard's rage only fed the fire. He stormed up and down the room, pointing fingers. Were you here late? Why didn't you lock up? And you? Don't look at me like that. I know when someone's lying. People shrank back, caught between confusion and fear. No one had answers. No one could explain how the company's prized equipment had just vanished overnight. Meanwhile, miles away, Sophia was sitting cross-legged on her couch, sipping coffee from her favorite mug. Around her, the missing gear gleamed in the morning light. Cameras stacked neatly, lights leaned against the wall, cables coiled like sleeping snakes. The entire state-of-the-art setup Richard once bragged about now sat quietly in her living room. She didn't rush to social media. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there, calm, watching the chaos unfold from a distance. Because she knew something Richard didn't. The gear was just the beginning. Back at the office, the panic was spreading like fire. Calls started coming in. A client's voice blared through the speakerphone. Why isn't the studio ready for our shoot? Another email popped up. We were promised a demo today. Where's the equipment? Richard fumbled with excuses. We had, technical issues. Nothing to worry about. We'll be back online soon. But his staff could see it in his eyes. He had no backup plan. He had built his reputation on borrowed tools, and now those tools were gone. And then came the twist no one expected. An intern, digging through the supply closet, found an old microphone stand. Scratched into the side of the metal, in permanent marker, were 5 letters. SOPHIA. He showed it to a co-worker. Then another saw a cable with the same marking. Soon whispers turned into murmurs. Murmurs into gasps. It was hers. All of it was hers. She took it back. The realization hit the staff like a shockwave. The quiet designer they'd all overlooked, the woman Richard had dismissed with a pink slip, had just turned the entire company upside down without saying a word. And the more people thought about it, the more it made sense. Sophia's late nights. Sophia's equipment always shows up first in shoots. The way Richard avoided mentioning her name in front of clients. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't a burglary, it was payback. Richard tried to spin it. He barked orders. Don't believe everything you see. She stole from us. This is theft. But his words fell flat. The employees weren't stupid. They knew what they were looking at. And deep down, many of them couldn't help but feel impressed. Here was a woman who had been dismissed, ignored, and pushed aside. And instead of crying or begging, she had flipped the entire script overnight. At home, Sophia set her coffee cup down, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She didn't just take back her gear, she gave Richard something he'd never forget. Exposure. The lie he had built his empire on was unraveling in front of everyone. And that was the point. Because revenge, for Sophia, wasn't about what she took away. It was about what she gave back. She gave Richard panic. She gave his employees the truth. She gave his clients doubt. And the best part? She didn't even have to show up to do it. The first call came before lunch, a client asking, almost casually, "Why is your studio dark?" Richard brushed it off, slick as ever. Power issue, he claimed. Nothing serious. But then, another call, and another. By 3 p.m., the phones wouldn't stop. The same question echoed, "Where's the work we paid for?" Richard scrambled, spitting out excuses, equipment upgrades, technical delays, staff shortages. But excuses don't film commercials. Excuses don't keep contracts alive. Clients wanted proof, results, and Richard had neither. The staff knew. They'd seen the empty studio. They'd seen Richard lose his mind, screaming at shadows. Some whispered it was sabotage. Others already guessed the truth. Sophia had taken back what was hers. Then, like gasoline on a fire, the photos appeared. At first a handful of grainy shots online. Sophia in her apartment, her gear stacked neatly, her name still marked on every case. Cameras, lights, cables. Everything Richard had bragged about, investing in. The images spread like wildfire. Clients forwarded them around with captions like, "So this was your big setup." Staff huddled over phones, eyes widening as the lie unraveled. Richard couldn't deny it, couldn't spin it. Every receipt, every label, every piece of proof screamed the same thing. None of it had ever been his. The man who once strutted like a king now sat cornered, his empire reduced to whispers and stares. Clients pulled contracts. Employees stopped listening. HR started asking ugly questions. And Sophia? She didn't lift a finger. She didn't need to. The photos did the work for her. The clients weren't just leaving. They were watching him fall, and this was only the beginning. The photos hit the inboxes like grenades. No warning, no explanation, just images. There was Sophia, calm, focused, working in her own apartment. Her cameras set up, lights glowing, cables snaking across the floor. The same gear Richard once paraded in front of clients, calling it his investment. Side by side, the truth was undeniable. Her name was on every case, every tripod, every cable tie, proof branded in black marker. The staff stared in silence. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads. All those speeches, all that bragging, none of it was real. The clients weren't laughing. They were furious. They'd paid Richard for a state-of-the-art studio. Instead, they saw screenshots of a designer he'd fired, sitting in her own place with the very tools they thought belonged to him. And HR? They moved fast. Emails, questions, documents. Did you know the equipment wasn't company-owned? Why was it never disclosed? Richard had no answers. No spin. No charm left. His empire wasn't crumbling anymore. It was already rubble. For years he'd worn the crown of visionary boss. Now every eye saw him for what he was, a fraud, living on borrowed shine. And Sophia? She didn't send a press release or speak a word. The photos told her story louder than she ever could. The king of the studio was never a king at all, just a man standing in ruins, stripped bare by the truth. The silence in the office was louder than Richard's shouts had ever been. Staff no longer rushed when he barked. They didn't even look up. Respect had drained from the room like air from a punctured balloon. Clients followed next. One by one, calls came in, contracts cancelled, meetings cut short, voices cold and final. "We can't trust you," they said. Deals he once boasted about evaporated overnight. Then HR stepped in. No friendly nods, no polite small talk, just questions sharp as knives. Why wasn't the equipment documented? Did you mislead the company? Did you lie to clients? Richard had no answers. He sat there, cornered, his face red, jaw clenched. Every excuse crumbled before it left his lips. This was the same man who strutted through the halls, chest out, bragging about his empire. Now he couldn't meet a single pair of eyes. The throne he had built wasn't just gone. It had never existed. Sophia didn't need to step inside that building to finish him. Her silence echoed louder than his screams. Every missing cable, every photo, every cancelled deal was a reminder the studio had never been his. The lights were off, but this wasn't just a blackout. It was the end of his reign. The studio was dark, but Richard's downfall had only begun. Sophia didn't storm into meetings. She didn't throw papers across a desk. She didn't yell, curse, or demand apologies. She didn't need to. Her revenge was never about noise. It was about silence, the kind that creeps in when the lies finally collapse, when the mask is ripped away, and the world sees someone for what they really are. And Richard? He had spent years building a throne out of stolen credit. He walked around the office like a king, chest high, voice booming, shaking hands with clients as if every light, every camera, every piece of brilliance belonged to him. But the throne wasn't real. It was cardboard painted gold. And the moment Sophia pulled her work away, the whole castle fell. At first people thought she had vanished quietly. A layoff, another name off the payroll, no big deal. That's how Richard saw it too. He thought she was disposable. He thought the studio was his kingdom, unshakable. But then came the silence. The cameras were gone. The lights were gone. The room looked like a graveyard of forgotten projects. And clients began asking questions. Questions Richard could no longer answer. He tried spinning excuses. He tried pretending the situation was under control, but it was already too late. The truth had started leaking. Sophia didn't post angry rants. She didn't try to expose him with cheap words. She let the pictures do it for her, the images of her working in her own space, with her own gear that had her name on it, gear that the company once paraded as Richard's cutting-edge arsenal. Side by side, the truth screamed louder than any speech could. Everyone saw it. Staff, clients, HR. The lie everyone had believed was shattered in a single moment. And Richard? The king of the studio sat cornered, silent, his crown nothing more than dust in his hands. That was the beauty of Sophia's revenge. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It didn't even look like revenge at all. It looked like the truth. And truth, when revealed at the right time, is sharper than any blade. Because Richard hadn't just lost his studio. He lost the story he told about himself. He lost the mask he had worn for years. And Sophia? She didn't break him. She simply stepped aside and let the world see him clearly. That's what most people don't understand about revenge. It doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes the sweetest form of it is exposure, pulling away the curtain and showing everyone that the powerful man was never powerful at all. Richard thought he owned the equipment. He thought he owned the success. He thought he owned Sophia. But in the end, he owned nothing, because the truth was never his to keep. And Sophia? She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need to stand on a stage and say, "I told you so." She had her work. The silence that once made her invisible had now made her unforgettable. And as Richard sat in the ruins of his empty studio, one fact became painfully clear. He hadn't been beaten by anger or sabotage or even betrayal. And if you like this story, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more shocking tales. Click the box on the left. Your next adventure is waiting.